So now I'm going to talk about how to import a package. So remember when we installed NumPy, we installed Pandas, we installed SciPy, and Matplotlib. So hopefully you installed those on your CPU, so you got experience doing that. They are pre-installed in the Jupyter Notebook and Google Colab. So we're not gonna have to worry about that if you're in this, but we will still see how to import them. So once they're installed, you can import it. So let's see how to import. So when we import something from a library, it will initialize the modules specified and in that library. So whatever is stored in that library, it will be imported into the local namespace, and it will be in our scope for the runtime we're using. Unless we restart our runtime, then we'll lose everything that we imported and we'll have to run the import line again. But once we import that, we can use all of the functions from that library. And if we don't have it installed, an import error will be raised. So let's import Matplotlib. So that Matplotlib will, as we'll see, it's good for, oh yeah, you can do this in Google Colab too to kind of get an idea of what it does. Okay, it's not showing up again, but if you hover over that, it will give you some information on what this is. So from Matplotlib pyplot as PLT. So when you put as and then you put PLT, for example, then anytime you want to use a function from Matplotlib, you can use PLT, just simply PLT, instead of having to write this whole thing out. So, and then a dot, and then the function from that library. So remember, this does some nice plotting. So it's useful for looking at our data. So in checking the range of our data, if say, like, for example, in machine learning, we use it a lot because we have a lot of data. And we want to look at a big plot of our data, so it's easier to handle and interpret. So we can kind of get a visualization. So let's do, so say we run this before importing this is going to cause an error because it's not going to know PLT is not defined. So let's import this first. We will now use it. So see what I was saying? It makes a nice plot for us. And we just plotted our y-axis is a list of 10 numbers. So remember, we talked about what lists are. And another useful function that we'll be using a lot, for example, we use these a lot in for loops because we can, it just, so let's see what x is. So it creates a range of numbers between 0 and that number. So if we put in like 5 here, we start at 5 and run it again, that's going to cause an error because we don't have enough data for the other axis. But let's just see how it starts at 5 now. So we're going to be writing for loops. See, it's even suggesting it. So for x in range, let's just get a little taste of a for loop. Range 3, print x. So what do you think that is going to print? If you said 0, 1, 2, you're right. And before we get any more fancy with for loops, I'm going to leave that for you to absorb. Because for loops will be very important, like very important. Like we're going to use a lot of loops. You have to use a lot of loops in coding. Okay, so let's get rid of this error and move on. So what is editing, saving, and running a Python program that we kind of talked about. Often it's useful to test snippets. Yeah, so like I was saying, these Python notebooks, Jupyter notebooks are useful because we can run blocks of code at a time. Even if we do put notes in our code, if we download, I think I forgot to note this, but when we download the .py file, it will comment out the notes for you, so you can still run it. So in Google Colab, you can do it that way. Okay. So lastly, I think this is the last thing. We talked about that range. So input might be useful if you're writing an interactive function because you can assign, so what this input function does is it provides a prompt to the user. So it will, whatever prompt we want, we put within these parentheses in the input function parentheses. So, like I was saying, functions usually have parentheses for our input to the function. Remember, our range had an input of the numbers we want to start and stop at. You could also do your range with 3 inputs or more to do even more sophisticated type of ranges, like skipping numbers, going backwards, and things like that. But we don't need to do that right now. But sometimes functions will have multiple inputs, but they accept multiple inputs, but you don't need to have them all in cases like this input. So we enter something as text to a prompt to the user, and it will save it as a string to this variable that we assign the result of this function to. And so say we want to write an algorithm that will find the area of a triangle. So remember, the area of a triangle is 1/2 the base times the height. So, sorry, I'm checking that the other video is recorded. Okay, so if it's saved as a string, we're not going to be able to. So remember, like if we we write a number in a string, we can't do any operations with it because this is improper syntax. So it's going to cause an error sorry, no, that's not improper syntax. We're just concatenating these strings now with the plus. But if we were to do like if we were to do to the power of 1, that's going to cause an error because these aren't integers. If we remove this, then it's going to read these as integers and it can give us the actual result of the equation. So we need to make sure, so our user input oops, let's see how this works first. Let me input something, 5, and then press enter. So that 5 is going to be stored in a string originally. As I was saying, the type of the user input is now a string. So we can't do our calculation to find our area of our triangle with the string. So there's a few things we can do. Like I was saying, like the more sophisticated your program, the better it's gonna work. So right now, there's a few things we can do to fix this simply. We could ask the user to enter a number. So the user might not even enter a number, and then it's going to cause an error in our program. So the more checks you put in your program, like find the type, we would, if we had more time, we would say if type user input is not an int or a float, ask the user for another input. We would code all that. But right now we're just gonna hope that the user enters a whole positive number by saying enter a whole positive number. If we were to just do what's your name, it wouldn't have to worry about it because it's already a string. And then we can say hello, which is kind of cool. And the type of that is a string. We don't have to worry because it automatically reads it in as a string. So enter a whole positive number. Let's assume that the user enters a whole positive number. And let's convert it to a float so that just adds a decimal. So good. So let's write this whole thing out. So say we can put 2 input statements and then save them each to different variables. One is going to be the base, one is going to be the height of our triangle. So enter in your triangle's base, and that will be stored to this triangle base variable. And I'll run this in a second. Then we're going to make sure these are both float by converting them to float. So this float is a function. Similarly, there'll be a function that we can use to convert things to string, to integer, and so on. So that's useful if we want to convert something back and forth. Some types can't be converted back and forth. So what else? So we'll print those, then we'll do the calculation 1/2 base times height. So remember, we now have floats stored in these 2 variable names. And so then we can write out this whole expression, and that result of the expression will be saved to triangle area variable, the variable named triangle area. So, and then we'll put a tab so it looks nicely when we print out the final triangle area. So let's do 5, 4, and that should be 10, right? 5 times 4 divided by 2 is 10. And that's a float because it has a decimal. So say we want to put this all into a program. So one thing you have to do is copy it like that. So remember, this is, we haven't mounted our drive, but I don't need this file again. So I'm just gonna name this triangle program so I don't have to change the code written right there. And then this is in my temporary workspace. So let's see, triangle program, that should be spelled correctly. And then when we put this percentage sign, did I copy that in good? Yes. And save that. So, now we're running it as a program. So this is the directory we're in. So let me just, I'll show you that after, but we would see that we're in this directory here on our remote CPU. So we can just run this through Python because it's in our workspace. So for example, if it was in sample data, we would have to write that it's in that file. So in case you guys don't know that. So 6 times 6 is 36. 36 divided by 2 is 18. And then remember, we can also run it directly from the terminal. This runs it through Python. This runs it through the terminal. Five times 8 is 40. It should result in 20. Okay, so we already talked about what this type function does a lot. So this is just some more examples. Type A equals 5 is a type Boolean. We haven't seen that. So remember, if we have an conditional, if we have an expression like this, where we have less than equal to, that's gonna result in a true or false result of our equation. So that's of class bool. So remember, we have scalar objects of integers, floats, none type, Boolean type, which is true and false, string. Yeah, and so like I was just showing, this range function is gonna come in use a lot because it's an easy way to write our for loops, for example. It creates an iterator. So we're going to want to iterate through a lot of things. Like as you can imagine, when we write these algorithms, we need them to run continuously for different reasons. Doing different tests on different types of objects, iterating through a string and modifying each string value. Say we're going through a paragraph of text and we want to check something in each word of the text. We might do while text is not, well, we haven't reached the end of it. Or if we knew that, so what we would do is for I in range length, we can put this, what we'll see, the length function that gives the length of a string or a length of a list. And we'll say when we get to the end of the list, we are done looping because we've checked everything in that. So we'll see examples. And remember, we can use this question mark to find out about a function if you forget. Help documentation. Start, stop. So remember I said you can also add a step. Is instance might also come in use if we want to put in a variable and then check if it is that specific type. Is 1 an int? Yes. 1.0 false because that's a float. Is it an int or a float? Yes, true. It's a float here because we have the decimal. What is int? And we can put a question mark after it. so that we can see what an integer is. Oh, I stuck this in here, I think when I was doing the first lesson. So remember, this is how you connect to your Google Drive. If you click this, it will mount your drive. And then we'll add this little code. So I'll just, okay, so I think I pressed no thanks because I don't want to mount it right now because we're almost done with this lesson. And then I'm going to go ahead and finish one of my machine learning lessons. Round is also a useful function if we have a long float. We can say how many decimal places we want to round to. Okay, so any questions whatsoever? I don't want anyone to have any questions about anything that I'm doing in here. I don't want anyone to not understand anything in here or be confused. Sometimes I go through this too fast or too slow, depending on the person's background. So if this is brand new to you, it might be more difficult, and I understand if it doesn't make sense. It's not straightforward when you are first learning. So, well, it might not be. So it takes practice. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and I'm happy to help. Okay, thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.